In the shadowy vaults beneath Buckingham Palace, where silence weighs heavier than gold and secrets shimmer brighter than diamonds, lies a collection that has witnessed love, betrayal, revolution, and power beyond imagination. These are not merely jewels. They are the silent witnesses to a woman's journey from a Danish princess with nothing but beauty and grace to becoming one of the most beloved queens in British history. Queen Alexandra's crown jewels tell a story that Hollywood could never script and historians struggle to fully uncover. Each emerald holds whispers of midnight conspiracies. Every sapphire reflects tears of joy and sorrow. And the diamonds, oh, the diamonds, they sparkle with the light of 1,000 untold secrets that could reshape everything we thought we knew about the British monarchy. What you're about to discover isn't just the tale of precious stones and golden crowns, it's the extraordinary true story of how a foreign princess transformed herself into Britain's most treasured queen, collecting along the way a fortune in jewels that would make modern billionaires weep with envy. But more than their monetary value, these gems carry within them the DNA of scandals, the fingerprints of kings and queens, and the soul of a woman who refused to be broken by the weight of a crown. From the moment young Alexandra stepped off a ship in Victorian England, destiny began weaving her story into the very fabric of these jewels. Little did she know that her collection would become legendary, surviving world wars, family feuds, and the changing tides of history itself. This is her story. Authentic, dramatic, and more captivating than any fairy tale ever written. The cold March wind whipped across the Thames as 17-year-old Princess Alexandra of Denmark stepped onto English soil for the first time in 1862. Her gloved hands clutched a small velvet pouch containing the only jewelry she truly owned, the simple pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother and a modest gold ring with her family's crest. She had no idea that within decades she would possess one of the most magnificent jewelry collections in the world, rivaling even the crown jewels themselves. Alexandra's journey to becoming the Princess of Wales began not with romance but with political necessity. The British royal family needed a bride for the future King Edward VII, then known as Bertie, and Alexandra's Danish heritage made her the perfect diplomatic choice. But what started as an arrangement would blossom into something far more complex and beautiful than anyone could have imagined. The first significant addition to Alexandra's jewelry collection came as a wedding gift from her future mother-in-law, Queen Victoria. The stern monarch, still mourning her beloved Prince Albert, presented Alexandra with the Rundell tiara, a magnificent piece crafted with over 1,000 diamonds arranged in delicate floral patterns. The tiara had been created in 1820 and carried with it the weight of royal tradition. As Victoria placed it carefully in Alexandra's hands, she whispered words that would prove prophetic. "This crown will witness your greatest joys and your deepest sorrows, my dear. Wear it with dignity, for it represents not just beauty, but the responsibility of our bloodline." The wedding ceremony at St. George's Chapel on March 10, 1863 was a spectacle that captured the imagination of the entire British Empire. Alexandra walked down the aisle wearing not only Queen Victoria's gift but also her mother's diamond Riviere necklace borrowed for the occasion. The necklace featured 47 graduated diamonds, each one catching the light streaming through the chapel's ancient stained glass windows. Witnesses later described how the jewels seemed to dance with their own inner fire, as if celebrating the union that would change the course of British history. But it was the wedding gifts that truly began Alexandra's legendary collection. The list of presents read like a treasure hunter's dream. The Emperor and Empress of France sent a magnificent sapphire and diamond parure, featuring a necklace, earrings, and brooch that showcased cashmere sapphires so blue they seemed to hold pieces of heaven itself. The Tsar of Russia, recognizing the diplomatic importance of the marriage, gifted an extraordinary set of emeralds from the Ural Mountains, each stone so perfectly matched and colored that European gemologists declared them the finest ever seen. The Indian princes, eager to curry favor with the British crown, outdid themselves in their generosity. The Maharaja of Patiala sent a collar of pearls so lustrous they seemed to glow with moonlight, while the Nizam of Hyderabad contributed a diamond necklace that featured the famous Hyderabad pink, a 75-carat pink diamond that would become one of Alexandra's most treasured possessions. The stone had a fascinating history, having been discovered in the Golconda mines and blessed by Hindu priests before making its way to British hands. Perhaps the most meaningful gift came from an unexpected source: the people of Denmark themselves. Alexandra's former subjects, despite their modest means, had pooled their resources to purchase what became known as the Danish ruby parure. The set included a tiara, necklace, earrings, and brooch, all featuring Burmese rubies surrounded by rose-cut diamonds. The rubies were said to represent the warmth of the Danish people's love for their princess, even as she left to become Britain's future queen. Alexandra's new role required her to understand not just the beauty of these jewels, but their political and social significance. Each piece told a story, carried diplomatic weight, and represented relationships between nations. The young princess quickly learned that wearing the right jewelry to the right event could smooth diplomatic tensions or reinforce important alliances. She began studying the history of each piece in her growing collection, understanding that she was not merely a collector but a curator of British royal heritage. One of the most significant early additions to her collection came through tragedy. When her husband's sister, Princess Alice, died young, Alexandra inherited several pieces that had been wedding gifts to Alice. Among these was the Hesse rose diamond brooch, a stunning piece that featured a 15-carat rose-cut diamond surrounded by smaller stones arranged in the shape of a wild rose. The brooch came with a note from Alice written shortly before her death, asking that Alexandra wear it to remember that even in the darkest winters, roses can bloom again. As Alexandra settled into her role as Princess of Wales, she began to develop her own unique style. Unlike Queen Victoria, who favored heavy, imposing pieces, Alexandra preferred jewelry that enhanced her natural grace and beauty. She often commissioned jewelers to modify existing pieces, creating new settings that better suited her taste. The famous jewelry house of Garrard became her preferred craftsman, and they worked closely with her to create pieces that would become iconic in their own right. The princess had a particular fascination with pearls, believing they represented purity and wisdom. She began collecting pearl necklaces from around the world, each strand carefully selected for its luster and quality. Her pearl collection eventually included strands from the Persian Gulf, Tahitian black pearls, and freshwater pearls from Scottish rivers. She would often layer multiple strands, creating a cascade of luminous spheres that became her signature look. But Alexandra's collection was about more than just accumulating beautiful objects. She understood the power of jewelry to communicate messages, to honor relationships, and to preserve memories. When she commissioned a new piece, she always ensured it had personal meaning. A brooch might commemorate a special anniversary, or a bracelet might honor a charitable cause she supported. One of her most cherished acquisitions during this early period was the Marlborough brooch, a piece that came to her through a fascinating chain of events. The brooch featured a 32-carat yellow diamond that had once belonged to Empress Josephine, Napoleon's first wife. After Josephine's death, the stone had passed through various European noble houses before reaching the Duke of Marlborough's collection. When financial difficulties forced the Duke to sell some of his treasures, Alexandra convinced her husband to purchase the brooch, not for its monetary value, but for its historical significance. The princess also began the tradition of commissioning pieces to commemorate significant events in British history. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, she had a bracelet created featuring alternating diamonds and sapphires arranged to represent the Mediterranean and Red Seas connected by the canal. The bracelet served both as a beautiful accessory and as a tangible reminder of Britain's growing global influence. Alexandra's growing reputation as a jewelry connoisseur attracted the attention of craftsmen and designers throughout Europe. They would send her sketches and proposals for new pieces, hoping to gain royal patronage. She carefully reviewed each proposal, sometimes accepting commissions that challenged traditional jewelry design. One such piece was the Constellation Tiara, which featured diamonds arranged to mirror the night sky on the date of her wedding to Bertie. The tiara required innovative techniques to achieve the three-dimensional effect of stars at different distances, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in jewelry craftsmanship. The early years of Alexandra's marriage were marked not only by the acquisition of magnificent jewels but also by the development of her understanding of their deeper significance. She learned that these pieces were not merely personal adornments but symbols of continuity, tradition, and the enduring power of the British monarchy. Each time she wore a particular piece, she was connecting herself to the long line of queens and princesses who had come before her, while also creating new traditions for those who would follow. As the 1860s drew to a close, Princess Alexandra had already established herself as one of the most stylish and sophisticated royals in Europe. Her jewelry collection, while still growing, had begun to take on the character that would make it legendary. But she had no idea that the greatest additions to her collection, and the most dramatic chapters of her story, were still to come. The foundation had been laid, the stage was set, and Alexandra was ready to step fully into her role as one of history's most fascinating royal collectors. The 1870s brought both triumph and heartbreak to Princess Alexandra's life, and with each emotional milestone came jewels that would forever mark these pivotal moments. The decade began with what many considered the most spectacular jewelry acquisition of the 19th century, the purchase of the legendary Koh-i-Noor's sister stone, the Timur ruby. Though this would later prove to be a magnificent spinel that had fooled even the most expert gemologists for centuries, Alexandra's fascination with this particular stone began during a dinner party at Marlborough House in 1871. A visiting Maharaja had mentioned in passing the existence of a ruby, sister to the Mountain of Light, referring to the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond that already resided in the British crown jewels. The Maharaja spoke of a stone so deeply red it appeared to hold liquid fire, inscribed with the names of 6 Mughal emperors who had owned it before it disappeared during the chaos following the Indian Rebellion of 1857. The search for this mysterious gem became Alexandra's obsession. She commissioned agents throughout the British Empire to investigate any leads, no matter how remote. The quest took nearly 2 years and led them through bazaars in Delhi, private collections in Calcutta, and eventually to a small shop in Jaipur, where an elderly gem merchant claimed to possess something that might interest the British crown. When the stone finally arrived at Marlborough House, carefully transported in a specially designed case, Alexandra's first glimpse of it took her breath away. The spinel measured almost 361 carats and glowed with an inner fire that seemed almost supernatural. Inscribed around its surface in Persian script were the names of the emperors who had treasured it: Akbar, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, and others whose empires had risen and fallen while this stone endured. But the Timur ruby came with a price beyond its monetary cost. Local legends claimed the stone brought great power to rulers but demanded sacrifice from their families. Alexandra dismissed such superstitions, but within months of the stone's arrival, her youngest daughter fell gravely ill. While Princess Louise eventually recovered, the coincidence haunted Alexandra and added an element of mystery to her growing collection that would persist throughout her life. The acquisition of the Timur ruby marked a turning point in Alexandra's approach to collecting. No longer content with simply receiving gifts or purchasing available pieces, she began actively seeking out gems with historical significance. Her agents reported back from around the world, describing artifacts that might appeal to her growing appetite for pieces with compelling stories. One such discovery was the Empress Eugenie's pearls, a rope of perfectly matched pearls that had belonged to Napoleon III's wife. When the French Empire fell and Eugenie fled to exile in England, she secretly sold many of her jewels to fund her new life. Alexandra, sympathetic to the fallen empress's plight and recognizing the historical importance of the pearls, arranged to purchase them through intermediaries to preserve Eugenie's dignity. The pearls became one of Alexandra's most frequently worn pieces, and she often said they reminded her that even emperors and empresses were subject to the whims of fate. The 1870s also saw Alexandra commissioning increasingly ambitious pieces from the finest craftsmen in Europe. The most spectacular was the peacock tiara, created by the legendary French jeweler Frédéric Boucheron. The tiara featured 3 peacock feathers crafted entirely from diamonds, sapphires, and emeralds, with each eye of the feathers containing a different precious stone. The central feather showcased a rare Petparacha sapphire from Ceylon, flanked by Kashmir sapphires and Colombian emeralds. The creation of the peacock tiara took 18 months and required innovations in jewelry construction that had never been attempted before. Boucheron had to develop new techniques for creating the flexible feather segments while maintaining the structural integrity needed to support the massive gems. The final piece weighed over 2 pounds and required special engineering to distribute its weight comfortably across Alexandra's head. But it was during the devastating tragedy of 1878 that Alexandra's collection took on its most poignant dimension. Her youngest son, Prince Alexander, died of pneumonia at the age of just 1 day. In her grief, Alexandra commissioned a memorial brooch from Garrard featuring a single perfect diamond surrounded by forget-me-nots, crafted from blue enamel and tiny sapphires. She wore this brooch on every significant royal occasion for the rest of her life, a constant reminder of the child she had lost. The memorial brooch began a tradition that would distinguish Alexandra's collection from all others. She began commissioning pieces to commemorate not just celebrations but also losses, creating a jewelry collection that told the complete story of her life's emotional journey. When her beloved mother, Queen Louise of Denmark, died in 1879, Alexandra had her mother's wedding ring incorporated into a new bracelet, surrounded by Danish amber and North Sea pearls that represented her homeland's enduring love. Alexandra's growing reputation as a discerning collector began attracting offers from the most unexpected sources. In 1880, she received a letter from an elderly Russian countess who claimed to possess jewelry that had belonged to Catherine the Great. The countess, facing financial ruin, was willing to part with pieces that had been in her family for over a century. Alexandra, intrigued by the possibility of owning gems that had adorned one of history's most powerful women, arranged for the collection to be secretly examined by British experts. The Russian collection proved to be authentic and spectacular. Among the pieces was Catherine's personal seal ring, featuring a 15-carat emerald engraved with the Russian imperial eagle, and a magnificent diamond necklace that Catherine had commissioned to celebrate the annexation of Crimea. But the most significant piece was a small, seemingly modest brooch containing what appeared to be an ordinary blue stone. Gemological examination revealed it to be a 12-carat blue diamond of exceptional rarity. possibly from the legendary Golconda mines of India. The acquisition of Catherine's jewels marked another evolution in Alexandra's collecting philosophy. She began to see her collection not just as personal adornment or even as symbols of royal power, but as a museum of women's history. Each piece represented a woman who had wielded influence, faced challenges, and left her mark on history. Alexandra began commissioning detailed histories of each piece, creating what amounted to the first scholarly catalog of royal jewelry. During this period, Alexandra also began developing relationships with emerging jewelry designers who would later become legendary names in their own right. She was among the first royals to patronize Louis Comfort Tiffany, commissioning him to create a series of nature-inspired brooches featuring American gemstones. These pieces, including a stunning maple leaf brooch crafted from Montana sapphires and Oregon sunstones, represented a new aesthetic that combined European sophistication with New World innovation. The princess's interest in American gems led to one of the most unusual additions to her collection. In 1882, she acquired what became known as the Liberty Bell tourmaline, a massive 200-carat green tourmaline from Maine that had been carved into a miniature replica of the American Liberty Bell. While the piece was more curiosity than traditional jewelry, it represented Alexandra's growing interest in gems as art objects rather than merely precious accessories. Alexandra's influence on jewelry fashion during this period cannot be overstated. Her preference for nature-inspired designs launched a trend that swept through European high society. Jewelers began creating elaborate pieces featuring flowers, birds, and insects, often incorporating innovative techniques that made the jewelry appear almost lifelike. Alexandra's famous butterfly brooch, featuring wings that actually moved when she walked, became the inspiration for countless similar pieces throughout Europe. But perhaps the most significant development of the late 1870s was Alexandra's decision to begin lending pieces from her collection for public display. She recognized that these magnificent objects, while personally meaningful to her, also represented cultural treasures that belonged to the British people. Her first exhibition, held at the South Kensington Museum in 1879, drew enormous crowds and established the precedent for royal jewelry being viewed as public heritage rather than purely private property. The exhibition revealed the true scope of Alexandra's collection for the first time. Visitors were amazed not just by the monetary value of the pieces, but by their incredible diversity and the stories they represented. From ancient Roman cameos to cutting-edge contemporary designs, from the simplest folk jewelry to the most elaborate ceremonial pieces, Alexandra's collection had become a comprehensive survey of the jeweler's art across cultures and centuries. As the 1870s drew to a close, Princess Alexandra had established herself not just as a collector, but as a patron of the arts and a guardian of cultural heritage. Her collection had grown from a few wedding gifts to one of the most significant private jewelry collections in the world. But more importantly, she had begun to understand her role as a custodian of history, preserving not just beautiful objects but the stories and traditions they represented. The foundation of her legendary status was now firmly established. Alexandra had proven herself capable of acquiring the finest pieces available while also commissioning innovative new works that pushed the boundaries of jewelry design. She had demonstrated an understanding of the cultural and historical significance of her collection that went far beyond mere ownership, and she had shown a willingness to share these treasures with the public, recognizing their importance as cultural artifacts. But the greatest challenges and triumphs of her collecting career still lay ahead. The next decade would bring her collection to international attention and establish her reputation as one of the most sophisticated and influential jewelry collectors in history. The stage was set for Alexandra to step fully into her role as not just a princess, but as a cultural icon whose influence would extend far beyond the borders of the British Empire. The 1880s opened with a scandal that would forever change how Alexandra viewed her role as both a collector and a member of the royal family. The infamous Ayesha's Emeralds affair began innocuously enough when a mysterious package arrived at Marlborough House with no return address, containing only a letter written in elegant Persian script and a single magnificent emerald the size of a robin's egg. The letter, when translated, told the tragic story of Princess Ayesha, a Mughal princess who had fled Delhi during the 1857 uprising with nothing but her jewelry collection. She had spent decades in exile, selling piece by piece of her inheritance to survive. Now elderly and dying in poverty in Bombay, she wished to entrust her final and most precious emerald to the British princess who honors the memory of stones and the stories they tell. Alexandra was deeply moved by this gesture and immediately dispatched agents to locate Princess Ayesha. What they discovered shocked the British colonial administration. Ayesha had indeed been living in desperate poverty, but she possessed detailed knowledge of dozens of significant gems that had been lost during the upheaval of the rebellion. More troubling, many of these gems had somehow found their way into the collections of British officials and merchants through questionable means. The discovery forced Alexandra to confront the complex moral implications of her collecting passion. She realized that many of the exotic pieces in European collections might have been acquired through exploitation or outright theft. This revelation led her to establish what she called her provenance protocol. No gem would enter her collection without complete documentation of its history and legitimate ownership. Princess Aisha died before Alexandra's agents could reach her, but she left behind detailed manuscripts describing the lost treasures of the Mughal court. These manuscripts became Alexandra's guide for what would become her most ambitious project: the systematic recovery and proper preservation of historically significant gems, regardless of their monetary value. The first success of this new mission came in 1883 when Alexandra learned of the Raja's ransom, a collection of Kashmir sapphires that had been pledged as collateral for a British loan to a desperate Indian prince 50 years earlier. The loan had never been repaid, and the gems sat forgotten in a London bank vault. Alexandra negotiated to purchase the collection not for herself, but to establish what she called the Commonwealth Gem Trust, which would ensure that historically significant stones were preserved for future generations rather than disappearing into private collections. The Raja's ransom consisted of 12 matched Kashmir sapphires, each over 20 carats and displaying the legendary cornflower blue color that made Kashmir stones the most prized in the world. But Alexandra's investigation into their history revealed an even more fascinating story. The sapphires had originally been part of a single massive crystal discovered in 1881 in the Padar Valley of Kashmir, during a landslide that exposed a previously unknown deposit. The original crystal had weighed over 400 carats, but political turmoil in Kashmir had forced its hasty cutting into smaller stones for easier transport and sale. Alexandra commissioned the legendary gem cutter Joseph Asher to study the 12 stones and determine if they could be reunited into a single piece. Asher's analysis revealed that the stones could indeed be combined into a spectacular tiara, but doing so would require revolutionary new setting techniques. The creation of the Kashmir Unity Tiara became a 2-year project that pushed jewelry craftsmanship to new heights. Asher developed a technique called invisible mounting that allowed the sapphires to appear suspended in air, held only by nearly invisible platinum wires. The completed tiara created an illusion of floating blue stars that seemed to move independently as Alexandra walked. But the Kashmir project also led to an unexpected discovery that would prove even more significant than the sapphires themselves. While researching the history of the original crystal, Alexandra's agents uncovered evidence of a lost manuscript written by the medieval gem trader Abu Rayhan al-Biruni, who had traveled throughout India documenting the locations of precious stone deposits. The manuscript, if it still existed, could provide clues to finding other lost sources of legendary gems. The search for al-Biruni's manuscript became Alexandra's secret obsession throughout the mid-1880s. She funded expeditions to libraries in Constantinople, Cairo, and Baghdad, following trails of references and rumors that had persisted for centuries. The quest led her agents through monastery libraries, private collections, and eventually to a small village in Persia where an elderly scholar claimed his family had guarded a particular manuscript for over 800 years. When the manuscript finally reached London in 1886, its authentication created excitement throughout the scholarly world. Al-Biruni's work not only documented historical gem sources, but included detailed drawings and descriptions that allowed experts to identify stones that had traveled far from their origins. More importantly for Alexandra, the manuscript contained references to gems that had been considered legendary, including the Star of Delhi, a massive star ruby that had supposedly been lost for over 3 centuries. The description of the Star of Delhi in al-Biruni's manuscript was so detailed that Alexandra became convinced the stone still existed somewhere. She began what amounted to an international treasure hunt, using her royal connections to gain access to private collections throughout Europe and Asia. The search took nearly 3 years and led to several significant discoveries, though not the star ruby itself. In Prague, she located a necklace of Bohemian garnets that had belonged to Empress Maria Theresa, complete with documentation proving its royal provenance. In Vienna, she discovered a collection of Hungarian opals that had been thought lost since the Revolution of 1848. Each find added not just to her collection but to the growing body of knowledge about the movement and preservation of historical gems. The breakthrough came in an unexpected way. In 1889, while examining a collection of minor gems offered for sale by a Russian noble family facing financial difficulties, Alexandra's expert noticed something unusual about what appeared to be an ordinary red stone set in a simple gold ring. Closer examination revealed the distinctive star pattern that identified it as a star ruby, and measurements showed it to be exactly the size described in al-Biruni's manuscript. The discovery of the Star of Delhi created international sensation. Here was a gem that had been worn by Mughal emperors, described by medieval scholars, and thought lost to history, yet it had been hiding in plain sight as part of an unremarkable collection. Alexandra's purchase of the ring for what the sellers considered a generous sum became one of the greatest bargains in jewelry history. But the Star of Delhi brought with it a mystery that would haunt Alexandra for years. According to al-Biruni's manuscript, the ruby had been part of a matched pair. 2 star rubies cut from the same crystal and known as the Eyes of Delhi. If one stone had survived, where was the other? The search for the second ruby led Alexandra to establish a network of correspondents throughout the world. Gem dealers, museum curators, private collectors, and even archaeologists began reporting to her about unusual stones they encountered. This network, which she called her Stone Circle, became one of the most effective intelligence-gathering operations of the Victorian era. Though its purpose was gems rather than military or political secrets, the Stone Circle's most spectacular success came in 1891 when a correspondent in Constantinople reported seeing a ruby matching the description of the second Eye of Delhi in the collection of a Turkish pasha. The stone had been incorporated into what appeared to be a traditional Ottoman dagger, but closer inspection revealed the underlying gem to be far older than its Islamic setting suggested. Acquiring the second Eye of Delhi required delicate diplomacy, as the pasha was reluctant to part with what he considered a symbol of Ottoman power. Alexandra eventually succeeded by offering to trade several pieces from her collection of Islamic jewelry, including a spectacular Fatimid necklace that had greater religious significance to the pasha than monetary value. When the 2 Eyes of Delhi were finally reunited in London, Alexandra commissioned a setting that honored both their ancient origins and their modern significance. The rubies were mounted as the centerpiece of a new crown, surrounded by diamonds arranged to represent the geographic journey the stones had taken over the centuries. The crown became known as the Traveler's Crown and represented Alexandra's philosophy that gems should be seen as cultural ambassadors rather than mere possessions. The 1890s also marked Alexandra's increasing involvement in the scientific study of gemology. She funded research into new techniques for analyzing gems, supported the establishment of gemological laboratories, and even commissioned experiments in synthetic gem creation to better understand how natural stones formed. Her collection became a research library where scientists could study examples of every known gem variety under controlled conditions. One of the most significant scientific contributions of Alexandra's collection was the identification of previously unknown color varieties in familiar gems. Her systematic documentation of every stone in her collection led to the recognition of new categories of sapphire colors, the identification of unique characteristics in gems from specific geographical sources, and the development of new criteria for evaluating gem quality. Alexandra also pioneered the use of photography in gem documentation. Working with leading photographers of the day, she created comprehensive photographic records of her collection that captured not just the appearance of each stone, but also demonstrated how different lighting conditions affected their color and brilliance. These photographs became invaluable references for gemologists and remain useful for researchers today. But perhaps Alexandra's most innovative contribution during this period was her recognition that gems could serve as historical documents themselves. By carefully analyzing the cutting styles, setting techniques, and wear patterns on antique pieces, she developed methods for dating jewelry and determining its geographical origins. This work laid the foundation for what would later become the academic field of jewelry archaeology. The decade concluded with what many considered Alexandra's greatest acquisition: the purchase of the entire gem collection of the Empress Elizabeth of Austria, following her assassination in 1898. Elizabeth, known for her beauty and her tragic fate, had assembled one of Europe's most distinguished private jewelry collections. Her sudden death left her collection without a clear inheritor, and her family chose to offer it to Alexandra rather than see it dispersed at auction. Elizabeth's collection included some of the most spectacular gems of the 19th century, including the Habsburg Rainbow, a series of colored diamonds representing every known diamond color arranged in a spectacular necklace. The collection also featured the famous Sissy stars, a set of diamond hair ornaments that had become Elizabeth's signature pieces and symbols of her free spirit. But more than the individual pieces, Elizabeth's collection represented a different approach to jewelry collecting. Where Alexandra focused on historical significance and cultural preservation, Elizabeth had collected purely for beauty and personal expression. The merger of these two philosophies in Alexandra's expanded collection created something unprecedented: a jewelry collection that combined scholarly rigor with artistic vision, historical importance with personal meaning. As the 19th century drew to a close, Princess Alexandra had established herself as the preeminent royal jewelry collector of her era. Her collection had grown beyond anyone's imagination, but more importantly, she had transformed the very concept of what it meant to collect gems. No longer were royal jewels simply displays of wealth or symbols of power. Under Alexandra's influence, they had become instruments of cultural preservation, scientific research, and artistic expression. The new century would bring new challenges and opportunities, including Alexandra's elevation to queen consort and the need to balance her personal collecting passion with her growing official responsibilities. But the foundation she had built during the 1880s and 1890s would serve as the cornerstone for achievements that would establish her as not just a collector, but as one of the most influential cultural figures of the early 20th century. The dawn of the 20th century brought both triumph and transformation to Alexandra's life. On January 22, 1901, Queen Victoria's death elevated her from Princess of Wales to Queen Consort, but more significantly, it placed her at the center of a constitutional crisis that would test not only her political skills but also her understanding of jewelry as a tool of diplomacy. The crisis began almost immediately after Edward VII's succession to the throne. The new king's well-known affairs and gambling debts had created scandals throughout his time as Prince of Wales, but as monarch, these personal failings threatened the stability of the institution itself. Alexandra realized that her role as queen would require her to use every tool at her disposal, including her legendary jewelry collection, to restore dignity and respect to the British crown. Her first major test came during the planning for the coronation ceremony. Traditional protocol required the new queen to wear specific pieces from the crown jewels, but Alexandra recognized an opportunity to make a statement about the monarchy's connection to the broader empire. She proposed creating a new coronation crown that would incorporate gems from every corner of the British territories, symbolizing the unity and diversity of the realm. The Imperial Unity Crown, as it became known, required nearly a year to complete and represented one of the most ambitious jewelry projects ever undertaken. The crown featured over 2,000 diamonds, but more importantly, it included significant gems from every British dominion. Canadian diamonds from the newly discovered Diavik deposits, Australian opals from Coober Pedy, South African diamonds from the Kimberley mines, Indian sapphires from Kashmir, and Burmese rubies from the Mogok region. But the crown's most significant feature was its central stone, a 150-carat blue-white diamond that Alexandra had secretly acquired through a complex arrangement with the De Beers Mining Company. The diamond, later named the Commonwealth Star, was notable not just for its size, but for the innovative cutting technique used to maximize its brilliance while maintaining its structural integrity. The creation of the Commonwealth Star required the services of Joseph Asher, who had previously worked on Alexandra's Kashmir Unity tiara. Asher spent months studying the rough stone before determining the optimal cutting approach, eventually deciding on a modified brilliant cut that incorporated 157 facets, far more than traditional cuts but necessary to fully realize the stone's potential. The coronation ceremony on August 9, 1902 was the first to be extensively photographed, and images of Alexandra wearing the Imperial Unity Crown circulated throughout the world. The visual impact was extraordinary. The crown seemed to capture and reflect light from every angle, creating an almost supernatural radiance that photographers struggled to capture adequately. But the true genius of Alexandra's coronation strategy became apparent in the weeks following the ceremony. She had commissioned detailed documentation of every gem in the Imperial Unity Crown, including photographs and descriptions of their sources. This information was distributed to newspapers throughout the empire, creating a shared narrative about how local resources contributed to the grandeur of the monarchy. The success of the Imperial Unity Crown led Alexandra to expand this concept into what she called the Empire Collection, a series of jewelry sets that would represent different aspects of British imperial achievement. Each set would tell a specific story about British exploration, trade, or cultural influence, using gems and precious metals sourced from the relevant territories. The first Empire Collection set honored Captain Cook's Pacific voyages and featured Tahitian black pearls, New Zealand jade, and Australian gold, arranged in designs inspired by Polynesian navigation instruments. The set included a magnificent necklace where the black pearls were arranged to represent the Southern Cross constellation, with the jade elements positioned to show the sailing routes Cook had followed. The second set commemorated the British presence in India and featured an extraordinary collection of gems that Alexandra had acquired through careful negotiation with various Maharajas. The centerpiece was the Maharani's Dream Necklace, which incorporated over 50 different varieties of Indian gems arranged in patterns based on traditional Hindu mandalas. But Alexandra's most ambitious Empire Collection project was the African Genesis set, which aimed to showcase the geological diversity of the African continent while acknowledging Britain's complex relationship with the region. The set required her to navigate the sensitive politics of colonialism while celebrating African contributions to global gem culture. The African Genesis set featured what was possibly the most unusual gem combination ever assembled in a single piece of jewelry. The centerpiece necklace included Tanzanian tanzanite, Zambian emeralds, Madagascar sapphires, South African diamonds, and Ethiopian opals, all arranged in a design inspired by traditional African textile patterns that Alexandra had studied extensively. Creating the African Genesis set also led Alexandra to one of her most controversial decisions as queen. She insisted that African craftsmen be involved in the design process, bringing master jewelers from various African cultures to London to consult on the project. This was unprecedented for a European royal court, and created considerable resistance from traditional British jewelers. The collaboration with African craftsmen proved transformative for both Alexandra's collection and British jewelry design more broadly. The African masters introduced techniques and aesthetic concepts that had been unknown in European workshops, including methods for setting stones that emphasized their natural characteristics rather than imposing predetermined design concepts upon them. One of the most innovative techniques introduced by the African craftsmen was called sympathetic setting, where gems were arranged according to their geological relationships rather than purely aesthetic considerations. Stones that had formed under similar conditions were grouped together, creating harmonious combinations that seemed to enhance each stone's individual character. The influence of these cross-cultural collaborations extended far beyond Alexandra's personal collection. European jewelers began incorporating African techniques into their work, leading to a revolution in jewelry design that would influence the Art Deco movement and continue to shape modern jewelry aesthetics. But perhaps the most significant development of Alexandra's reign as queen was her decision to begin systematically documenting and preserving the techniques used to create her collection. She recognized that the knowledge possessed by master craftsmen was often passed down through informal apprenticeships and could be lost if not properly recorded. In 1905, Alexandra established what she called the Royal Workshop Documentation Project, which aimed to create comprehensive records of every technique used in the creation of royal jewelry. Master craftsmen from around the world were invited to London to demonstrate their skills, while scribes and photographers created detailed records of their methods. The documentation project revealed the extraordinary complexity and sophistication of traditional jewelry-making techniques. Many processes that European craftsmen considered primitive were actually highly advanced solutions to specific technical challenges. African goldsmiths, for example, had developed techniques for working with very pure gold that European artisans had never mastered. The project also led to important discoveries about the history of jewelry making itself. By comparing techniques used in different cultures, researchers were able to trace the paths by which jewelry-making knowledge had spread around the world, revealing connections between seemingly unrelated cultures separated by vast distances and centuries of time. One of the most significant discoveries was evidence that ancient African techniques had influenced early European jewelry design through trade connections that predated the Roman Empire. This finding challenged prevailing assumptions about the direction of cultural influence and helped establish African civilizations as important contributors to global artistic development. Alexandra's commitment to cross-cultural understanding through jewelry also led her to establish the first international exhibitions devoted specifically to jewelry as art. The inaugural International Exhibition of Jewelry Arts, held at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1907, brought together pieces from around the world, displayed not as curiosities but as serious artistic achievements worthy of scholarly study. The exhibition format Alexandra pioneered emphasized the cultural context of each piece, explaining not just its technical qualities but also its role in the society that created it. Visitors could see how different cultures solved similar design challenges, how religious beliefs influenced aesthetic choices, and how political events affected artistic development. The success of the 1907 exhibition led to the establishment of a permanent International Jewelry Studies Institute, with Alexandra serving as its founding patron. The institute became a center for scholarly research into jewelry history and continues to operate today as one of the world's leading academic institutions devoted to the study of jewelry and decorative arts. But Alexandra's most personal achievement during this period was the completion of what she called her memory palace, a private room in Buckingham Palace where she displayed pieces from her collection arranged according to their personal significance rather than their monetary value or artistic importance. The Memory Palace included pieces that marked every significant moment in Alexandra's life, from her childhood in Denmark through her years as Princess of Wales to her current role as Queen. Each piece was accompanied by detailed notes in Alexandra's own handwriting explaining its significance and the circumstances of its acquisition. Among the most poignant pieces in the Memory Palace was a simple gold bracelet set with modest garnets that Alexandra had purchased with her own pocket money during her first year in England. The bracelet had no particular artistic merit and was worth very little compared to the magnificent pieces that surrounded it, but it represented her determination to maintain her individual identity, despite the overwhelming responsibilities of royal life. The Memory Palace also included pieces that commemorated losses and sorrows, not just triumphs and celebrations. The memorial brooch for her infant son Alexander held the place of honor, but it was joined by other pieces that marked difficult periods. A ring made from metal salvaged from a ship that had sunk with friends aboard, earrings commissioned to commemorate servants who had died in her service, and a locket containing soil from the graves of her parents in Denmark. Alexandra's willingness to give equal prominence to pieces representing sorrow and joy distinguished her approach to collecting from that of her predecessors. Previous royal collections had emphasized power, wealth, and triumph, but Alexandra's collection told a more complete human story that acknowledged the full range of human experience. This philosophical approach to collecting influenced how Alexandra planned for the future of her collection. Rather than simply passing pieces to her heirs, she began developing a system that would ensure the most historically significant pieces remained together while allowing personally meaningful items to go to family members who would appreciate their emotional significance. The system Alexandra developed became known as the Graduated Heritage Protocol, which divided her collection into categories based on their significance to different constituencies. Some pieces would remain with the crown jewels as symbols of monarchy, others would go to museums as cultural artifacts, and still others would pass to family members as personal mementos. But the most innovative aspect of the Graduated Heritage Protocol was Alexandra's decision to return certain pieces to their countries of origin. She recognized that some gems in her collection had cultural and religious significance that transcended their role as personal adornments, and she began the process of repatriating pieces that would be better preserved and honored in their original cultural contexts. The first major repatriation was the return of a sacred emerald Buddha that had been gifted to the British Crown under questionable circumstances during the colonial period in Burma. Alexandra's research had revealed that the piece had been taken from a temple during military action and that its absence was still mourned by the local Buddhist community. The return of the emerald Buddha created considerable controversy within British government circles, as it established a precedent that could lead to demands for the repatriation of many objects in British museums and private collections. But Alexandra persisted, arguing that the monarchy's moral authority depended on its willingness to acknowledge past wrongs and make appropriate amends. The success of the Emerald Buddha repatriation led to several other returns, each carefully negotiated to ensure that the objects would be properly preserved and honored. These actions enhanced Britain's relationships with several former colonies and established Alexandra as an early advocate for what would later become known as cultural property rights. As the first decade of the 20th century drew to a close, Queen Alexandra had transformed not only her own jewelry collection, but also the entire concept of how royal collections should be understood and managed. Her innovations in documentation, exhibition, cross-cultural collaboration, and ethical collecting had established new standards that would influence museums and collectors worldwide. But perhaps most importantly, Alexandra had demonstrated that jewelry collecting could serve purposes far beyond personal adornment or wealth display. In her hands, gems had become tools of diplomacy, instruments of education, and vehicles for cross-cultural understanding. The stage was now set for the final phase of her collecting career, when global events would test all of these innovations and establish her lasting legacy as one of history's most influential cultural figures. The final chapter of Queen Alexandra's extraordinary jewelry legacy began with the shadow of World War looming over Europe in 1914. What few could have predicted was how dramatically the Great War would transform both the purpose and meaning of royal jewelry collections, forcing Alexandra to confront choices that would define her legacy for generations to come. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, Alexandra immediately understood that her collection would play a crucial role in the war effort, but not in any way that previous monarchs might have imagined. Rather than simply donating pieces to be sold for war bonds, she conceived of a revolutionary approach that would transform royal jewelry from symbols of privilege into instruments of national unity and international diplomacy. Her first initiative was the creation of what she called the Victory Garden Collection, a series of jewelry pieces designed to be worn by women from all social classes as symbols of their contribution to the war effort. Working with simplified designs that could be mass-produced using less expensive materials, Alexandra created patterns based on her most famous pieces that could be manufactured affordably while maintaining their symbolic power. The Victory Garden pieces were made from silver, bronze, and semi-precious stones, but their designs were unmistakably derived from Alexandra's royal collection. A factory worker could wear a bronze version of the Commonwealth Star brooch, a nurse could pin on a simplified version of the peacock tiara design, and a munitions worker could wear earrings inspired by the eyes of Delhi rubies. But Alexandra's most audacious wartime decision was to secretly remove the most valuable pieces from her collection and arrange for their hidden storage in secure locations throughout the empire. She recognized that if Britain fell to German invasion, these cultural treasures would be lost forever, dispersed as war prizes to private collections or melted down for their raw materials. The operation to secure the collection required unprecedented cooperation between the royal household, British intelligence services, and trusted contacts throughout the British territories. Pieces were carefully documented and photographed before being sealed in specially designed containers that would protect them from both environmental damage and detection by X-ray equipment. Some pieces were hidden in purpose-built vaults beneath seemingly ordinary buildings in Canada and Australia. Others were disguised as industrial equipment and stored in South African mining facilities. The most valuable items were broken down into their component stones, which were individually hidden in locations so diverse that reassembling them would require access to a master list that Alexandra kept in her personal possession. The precautions proved wise when German bombing raids began targeting London in 1915. Marlborough House suffered damage that would have destroyed priceless artifacts if they had remained in their traditional storage areas. Alexandra's foresight preserved not only her personal collection, but also many pieces belonging to other members of the royal family who had followed her example. But the war also presented Alexandra with unexpected opportunities to expand her collection's cultural significance. As European aristocratic families fled their ancestral homes, many offered to sell or donate jewelry pieces to the British Crown in exchange for safe passage or financial support. Alexandra established criteria for accepting these pieces that prioritized historical significance over monetary value. Among the most significant wartime acquisitions was the Romanov exile collection, jewelry that had belonged to members of the Russian royal family who had escaped the revolution. These pieces, smuggled out of Russia often at great personal risk, carried with them the stories of one of history's most tragic royal dynasties. The centerpiece of the Romanov collection was Empress Alexandra Feodorovna's personal tiara, a magnificent piece featuring Russian diamonds arranged in a pattern based on traditional Orthodox Christian symbolism. The most impossible consequence about to the younger Romans a daughter, and essentially dato. The locket contained a photograph of the entire family taken during happier times, and its presence in Alexandra's collection served as a memorial to the innocents lost during the Russian Revolution. Alexandra's acquisition of Romanov pieces was controversial, as some critics argued that she was profiting from the Russian family's tragedy. But she countered these criticisms by establishing the Romanov Memorial Trust, which would preserve these pieces as historical artifacts while using any income they generated to support Russian refugees and Orthodox charities. The war years also marked Alexandra's most systematic effort to document the complete history of her collection. Recognizing that her advancing age and the uncertain times made it crucial to preserve this knowledge, she began working with a team of scholars to create what became known as the Alexandra Codex, a comprehensive catalog of every piece in her collection with complete historical documentation. The Codex project took nearly 4 years to complete and resulted in 12 volumes of text plus hundreds of detailed photographs and technical drawings. Each entry included not only basic information about a piece's materials and construction, but also its complete provenance, cultural significance, and role in Alexandra's broader collecting strategy. But the Codex also revealed patterns in Alexandra's collecting that had not been apparent before. Statistical analysis showed that she had systematically sought pieces from every major gem-producing region of the world, creating what amounted to a geological survey of the Earth's treasures. She had also consistently favored pieces with documented royal provenance, assembling what was effectively a museum of monarchical history told through jewelry. Perhaps most significantly, the Codex demonstrated that Alexandra had consciously collected pieces representing every major period of jewelry-making history, from ancient Egyptian artifacts to cutting-edge contemporary designs. Her collection had become a comprehensive timeline of human artistic achievement in the field of jewelry arts. The completion of the Alexandra Codex in 1919 coincided with the end of the war and the beginning of a new phase in Alexandra's life. Now in her mid-70s, and having been widowed by Edward VII's death in 1910, she began the process of determining how her extraordinary collection would be preserved and shared with future generations. Her first major decision was to donate a significant portion of her collection to the newly established Imperial War Museum, specifically pieces that had been acquired during the war years or that commemorated wartime events. This donation included the Victory Garden prototypes, several pieces from the Romanov collection, and jewelry that had been created from metals salvaged from British warships. The Imperial War Museum donation established a precedent that Alexandra followed for the remainder of her life. Rather than keeping her collection intact as a monument to her personal achievements, she would distribute pieces to institutions and individuals who could best preserve their historical significance and cultural value. Alexandra's next major donation was to the British Museum, which received her collection of ancient and archaeological jewelry pieces. This donation included Roman cameos, medieval reliquaries, and prehistoric amber jewelry that Alexandra had acquired over the decades. The British Museum used these pieces to establish the world's first comprehensive exhibition devoted to jewelry as historical artifact. But Alexandra's most personally meaningful donation was to the Victoria and Albert Museum, which received what she called her Master Craftsman collection, pieces that demonstrated exceptional technical skill regardless of their monetary value. This collection included examples of every major jewelry-making technique that had been developed throughout history, serving as an educational resource for future craftsmen and designers. The V&A donation also included all of the documentation from Alexandra's Royal Workshop documentation project, creating an invaluable archive of traditional jewelry-making techniques that might otherwise have been lost. This documentation continues to be used by contemporary jewelry makers seeking to understand and revive historical methods. Alexandra's final major institutional donation was to the newly established Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., which received her New World collection, pieces featuring gems and materials from the Americas. This donation helped establish the Smithsonian's reputation as an international center for gem and mineral studies, while acknowledging America's growing importance in global affairs. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of Alexandra's legacy planning was her decision to create what she called traveling heritage collections, sets of jewelry pieces that would tour the world, allowing people in distant locations to see and study examples of her collection. These traveling exhibitions helped establish the concept of international cultural exchange through museum loans. The first traveling heritage collection toured the British dominions, bringing examples of Alexandra's Imperial Unity Crown and Empire collections to audiences in Canada, Australia, South Africa, and India. The tour was enormously successful, drawing crowds that exceeded anything previously seen for cultural exhibitions in these regions. Subsequent traveling collections visited the United States, continental Europe, and eventually Asia and South America. Each tour was carefully designed to highlight connections between the local culture and pieces in Alexandra's collection, creating opportunities for dialogue about shared heritage and cultural exchange. Alexandra's personal life during these final years was marked by increasing frailty but undiminished intellectual curiosity about gems and jewelry. She continued acquiring pieces until very late in life, though her focus shifted toward items of particular historical or scientific interest rather than purely decorative objects. One of her last major acquisitions was a collection of meteorite jewelry, pieces crafted from materials that had fallen to Earth from space. Alexandra was fascinated by the idea that these pieces contained materials older than the Earth itself, representing a connection to the cosmos that transcended earthly concerns about wealth or status. The meteorite collection included a remarkable necklace crafted from the Allende meteorite, which had fallen in Mexico in 1969 and been dated to over 4.5 billion years old. Alexandra commissioned a setting that preserved the meteorite's natural structure while making it wearable, creating what she called jewelry from the birth of the solar system. As Alexandra approached her 90th birthday in 1934, she began the final phase of distributing her personal collection to family members and close friends. Each piece was accompanied by a personal letter explaining its significance and her wishes for how it should be preserved or passed down to future generations. The most treasured family pieces went to her children and grandchildren, but Alexandra ensured that each recipient understood their responsibilities as custodians of historical artifacts. She established trust funds to cover the costs of properly maintaining and insuring these pieces, recognizing that their preservation required resources that future generations might not possess. Queen Alexandra died peacefully at Sandringham House on November 20, 1925, surrounded by family members who wore pieces from her collection as a final tribute to her extraordinary legacy. Her funeral was attended by royalty from throughout Europe, many wearing jewelry that had connections to pieces in Alexandra's collection, creating a visual celebration of the international network she had built through her collecting passion. The complete impact of Alexandra's jewelry legacy became apparent only in the years following her death, as institutions around the world began to fully utilize the pieces she had donated. Museum exhibitions, scholarly research, and educational programs based on her collection reached millions of people, fulfilling her vision of jewelry as a tool for cultural understanding and historical education. Today, nearly a century after her death, Queen Alexandra is remembered not just as one of history's greatest jewelry collectors, but as a pioneer who transformed how we think about the role of royal collections in preserving and sharing cultural heritage. Her innovations in documentation, exhibition, cross-cultural collaboration, and ethical collecting continue to influence museums and collectors worldwide. The pieces from her collection that remain in public institutions continue to inspire new generations of craftsmen, designers, and collectors. Her documentation methods are still used as models for proper curatorial practice, and her approach to international cultural exchange through traveling exhibitions has become standard practice for major museums. But perhaps most importantly, Alexandra demonstrated that great collections are not simply accumulations of valuable objects, but carefully curated narratives that can educate, inspire, and unite people across cultural and national boundaries. In transforming her personal passion into a tool for cultural diplomacy and historical preservation, she created a legacy that extends far beyond the glittering gems that first captured her imagination as a young Danish princess arriving in Victorian England. The complete story of Queen Alexandra's crown jewels and treasured gems stands as testament to the power of vision, dedication, and cultural sensitivity in creating collections that serve not just personal interests but the broader cause of human understanding and appreciation for the artistic achievements of our shared global heritage. Queen Alexandra's complete crown jewels and treasured gems.